Okay, I think we're live. I think you've joined us. We're in Liverpool. Some of us are in Liverpool. Not everyone's in Liverpool. We'll come to that in a minute. I can't see you on the screen at all, which I normally can do, but I can't do this time. I hope you're all well and enjoying the conference season. We're going to kick off now. Welcome to this issue of It's Bloody Complicated. We're delighted to be joined by two wonderful guests at the moment. We might be joined by more, but let's see how that goes. Some of us are live from the Labour conference in Liverpool, I'm going to be asking the question about whether Labour is ready to win and govern effectively. At the moment in Liverpool, we've got the wonderful Zoe Grunewald from the New Statesman. She's the policy and politics correspondent for the wonderful New Statesman. And in London, we've got joining the fantastic Steve Richards, who's been many parishes, but now mainly he's the wonderful podcast, Rock and Roll Politics, and all the live shows that Steve does on rock and roll politics. So welcome both of you. Great to have you here, and thank you so much for being here. So two big issues to address in light of the Keir Starmer speech today. Can Labour win and can it govern effectively? The broad compass view is that winning is obviously necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have huge concerns that Labour's poll lead is biggish now, but it could be quite brittle. And the progressive vote might split again, and that many people just won't be motivated to vote, and that the Tory campaign will be really brutal up against a fairly narrow Labour platform, but maybe it's been broadened out today by Keir Starmer. Let's have a chat about that and see. And if there is a Labour or Labour-led government, it won't be ready for the perma-crisis world it will inherit. So, it's going to come up against reality at some stage, and speeches are great, but reality can be tougher and could collapse into a crisis quite quickly, potentially paving the way for something that could be, some form of resurgent populist right-wing politics, which will be a worry. The format is ever is that I'll ask our guests some questions, and it will be over to you for our members to ask your questions and put your comments. Please keep your questions and comments brief so we can get as many people as possible. You'll be invited to speak as ever by Harry. Post your questions in the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the bar of the screen. And put any thoughts or links in the chat box. Say hello to everyone. Tell people what you think about the conferences, how you are, where you are. Talk as you normally wonderfully do. Please tweet about the conversation if you want using the @CompassOffice. And obviously note that this whole recording is going to go out on a podcast at the end of the week. So we've heard the speech today. Within that context, and we'll kind of go into the speech a bit more about what you both think about it. But first, maybe you, Zoe, because I've got you here nice and live in this studio. Do you think Labour's going to win? If you think they're going to win, by what kind of margin? And what are the dynamics at play around, between now and the election, which are going to determine whether Labour wins and how big Labour might win?
So, yes, I think they're going to win. I don't like putting a number on it because I'm obviously going to be wrong no matter what I pick, but I do think they will get a majority. Of course, there are things that can change. I mean, and there are a number of things outside of their control that can change. So at the minute, as you said, Labour's got a poll lead. You think it's quite brittle, and I happen to agree to some extent because I think that at the minute, Starmer is really riding high on the Conservatives being in a lot of difficult positions over policy issues and, of course, internal divisions within their own party. So, of course, part of what might determine whether or not Labour win is how successful the Tories are. At the minute, they're doing badly. But, of course, we don't know what's going to happen by the time we call a general election. So if the economy's improving, that might bolster Sunak and, of course, Hunt as well. If small boat crossings are down, that might bolster their voter base. The number of people who might have swung to Labour because of migration, because of the Tories' failure on migration, might swing back. There's also, of course, issues with Labour. At the minute, Labour are very united. I was just watching Starmer's speech, and there was, the Labour Party were very united. There's been, it's been really disciplined. Everybody's been on message. That's all, The
bloke with the glitter wasn't very disciplined, was he?
No, he wasn't actually, no. But in terms of sort of members, they're all kind of, adhering to the party line on things. And that's good for Labour's support base. It's good for the public to see. It looks like a different party. But we don't know if it's going to stay that way. There are a few issues that could possibly divide them. We've seen a bit of disquiet over, for example, the two-child benefit cap. Yeah. Obviously, broader questions around Labour's spending priorities. I think, to be fair, I do think the public will also be asking, okay, Starmer talked a lot about reform and things like that today, but some things like school buildings, like the NHS, seem to just need a big injection of funding.
Yeah.
And when you have a Shadow Chancellor who's very fiscally conservative in many ways, that's something that you could see the left of the party pushing for a bit more. And then, of course, there's the Lib Dems and the Greens who can potentially splinter, some of Labour's vote in certain areas. And we're seeing that play out a little bit in Mid-Bedfordshire at the minute. That could be a Labour seat, but if the Lib Dems continue fighting it, it's going to get more and more tense. So,
or it could be a Lib Dem seat if Labour keep fighting it.
Depends who you ask.
Yeah.
But totally. So there's a number of things I think that can really impact it. But I do still think Sunak, he gets worse by the day. I mean, in terms of his media performance, I think he's crumbles. I don't think he likes scrutiny. I don't think he likes people telling him he's made the wrong decision. I think he thinks he works very hard and should be, treated as such. And the Conservatives, I was at the Conservative Party conference. They have absolutely no direction. And when you compare Sunak's speech to Starmer's, it's just totally void of substance, I would say. So I don't think the Conservatives are really going to turn it around that much. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the economy. The economy may well improve. But I kind of think most people feel that the Conservatives have had 13 years and it's time for a new government.
Okay, and we'll come back to the speech in a bit. Steve, are Labour going to win, and what's going to shape the result?
Yeah, I think they will win. The nature of the victory, of course, no one can predict with any certainty. But at the moment, they're going to win with an overall majority. I don't think it will be huge, but it could be the sort of size that Thatcher got in 79, for example, 50, 60, that kind of thing. That's now. Who knows what will happen over the next year? I don't think the election will be until the autumn of next year. So lots could happen. But we know the main dynamic driving this. It's an anti-Tory dynamic, and we can root it. We can root it in the Truss disaster, when Labour very quickly got a huge opinion poll lead. Now, I've wondered ever since, I know you have, Neil, how soft it is and whether it could fall entirely. Party conferences can often be totally irrelevant. I don't think the ones over the last couple of weeks have been. The Tory one was really shambolic, and Sunak wasn't really in control of it or the agenda. And I agree that his projection is poor, surprisingly bad. So I came away from that conference thinking, if one of the two bigger parties are going to screw up over the next 12 months, it's quite likely to be the Tories again. I can't see that they are sophisticated or agile enough to come back. And I know we're going to go into more detail about Starmer's speech at the Labour Party conference, but I think for the first time, there are many gaps, which I'm sure we'll explore as well. He put forward a coherent argument about active government and an active state, and was dismissive of what he called the stand-aside state of the Tories. There was a sort of more of a kind of values-based argument throughout the speech, which I think could, if he develops it, big if, have wider positive appeal. So I think these last 2 weeks have been quite significant.
Well, let's keep you going on that, given you started on the Starmer speech, and then go over to Zoe to see what more about that. I thought it was a strong speech. I think I agree it had the moral core. It was really good that he was talking about class. But then, if you talk about class, you have to talk about capitalism. And forgive me, everyone, but I was sort of missing out on that big Blairite kind of sweep of globalization, where technology's going, what the big forces are. It was quite technocratic, wasn't it? And I worry that he's built up quite a lot of expectation without any money. So I think there may be some hostages to fortune in it. Steve, carry on and tell us what you think, then we'll find out from Zoe.
I don't think it was technocratic. Indeed, I'm really pleased, because I thought, Keir Starmer wrote one of the worst articles I've ever read from a Labour leader in many years in the Observer in July, and it was all lifted from Tony Blair around 2003, literally lifted. The phrases about comfort zone and tough choices. And I thought, oh God, are we going to have a speech in Liverpool about we have changed, we're on the centre ground, it's all about reform and technology, these terms that Tony Blair deploys.
I heard quite a lot of that today. Was I listening to a different speech? I thought I did.
Oh no, I thought it was. I mean, he mentioned reform. Of course, who's against reform? The debate is what form reform takes. But I thought there was a much more interesting argument. He didn't mention this imprecise term, "we're on the centre ground." Everyone thinks they're on the centre ground. It's meaningless. Instead, I thought he developed a really important argument about the state working with other agencies to develop economic growth, to improve and revive public services, and so on. Now, you are right. The gap, I don't think the gap in his speech was a moral argument. There was a sort of moral argument there. The gap, as you also imply, is the means. Because the context of this next election is people aching for change. And you've got to explain some of the how, not all of it. You can't just say we're now on this moral mission to renew Britain and to rebuild Britain without something more than a non-dom tax that apparently is going to transform everything.
Yeah.
So there were bigger gaps than that as well, and nothing on social care, which is a huge issue. And they've got the protective shield that the Tories proposed it in December 2019, and they haven't done it. Nothing on Europe, nothing on, or very little on how we govern and constitutional matters. So there were big gaps, but there was, I thought, a moral argument.
Yeah, I agree.
Actually.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that was good to hear. Zoe, what were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I thought that was a really good analysis. I think the Europe stuff is interesting. I mean, there's two reasons why they might leave stuff out of it, or there's also a secret third reason, which is that they haven't thought of it. But there's actually two reasons why they tend to leave stuff like that out of speeches. The first is that it's just a bit controversial or problematic, and it needs more talking through and more thinking about before it's taken to the general public in the form of a big, conference speech. The other is that they might have something really good that they don't want to give to the Conservatives, and they don't want to be stolen. And I wonder if social care is something, because I agree, I think it was noticeably kind of missing, but it's such an important part of our healthcare system and keeping the NHS fit for purpose as well, the NHS is one of their 5 missions. So I suspect there will be more about that, possibly in their manifesto. But yeah, I thought that was a really good analysis of the speech. I thought Starmer did really well. I thought he came across as very confident. I thought he was quick. He responded to the protest really well. So well, I actually wondered if he set it up because he had a gag in his pocket about, protest or power. That's why we've reformed the party. I thought he did really well. I think what was interesting about his speech and what I think will be quite effective was his argument that the Conservatives just aren't fit to govern anymore because they are so held up by vested interests. And that's why there is no change. That's why there's no reform. And, he talks about things like planning reform, things about, building more houses. They're all examples of how it's been so stagnant under the Conservatives because they have vested interests there. They're party of NIMBYs, essentially. So I think that was a really good argument, and I think he made it well. I think he made the point about sort of Sunak not being able to see past the high walls of Westminster, which, by the way, I think he missed a great opportunity for a gag there about Sunak's height.
Yeah, quite.
You're not allowed to do that, though.
I know. I bet
You might be able to tell that we've been joined by Zoe Williams. There's never enough Zoes on our podcast, and she'll come in a minute.
There's never more than one Zoe, so it's nice to have a second, isn't it? But yeah, no, I thought it was a really good speech. I think the housing. What really struck me was in Sunak's speech there was just nothing for young people. Right, there was you're no longer allowed to smoke, which I think is a good measure. And then there was you'll be doing maths and English till 18. And it was, there was no carrot with the stick. There was no, and we're going to build more houses, and we're going to, start all these skills programs, and we're going to adhere to our environmental targets. Whereas Starmer's speech felt much more long term. It was like, we're going to build these new technical colleges. We are going to build more houses. We are going to stick to our environmental pledges. And it felt like he was engaging with the younger vote a lot more. And, at the end of the day, young people are the foundation of the future of politics. So it's important to be able to appeal to them. And it just shows you how much the Conservatives are stuck in the appealing to older Conservative voters because it's the only way they can cling on to their base and keep the party together.
Yeah. So I think you've been able to tell Zoe Williams that we're talking about the speech. So Steve's had a go and Zoe's had a go. Now you don't know what they've said very much. So what did you think about it?
There was this really funny moment in it where he said, let's end pensioners
Oh, did he? Yeah, I think that's a good electoral move, isn't it?
Yeah. That's exactly what I was talking about. Yeah,
everybody started clapping, and you were like, why not just end pensions? Sorry, no, I'm not. That is not my policy take home. I was genuinely moved, and I don't say this without embarrassment. I was genuinely moved at the last line. When he said, I've been in a working class family, I know what it's like to have that anxiety. And for as long as you've got it, I'll fight for you. I thought, actually, yeah, I like it. I like it. And you know how disappointed I've been with him as a leader.
Yeah.
And you know how disappointed I've been in the kind of offer.
Yeah.
But as a speech, standalone, I liked it.
Yeah, I agree. We were saying it's solid, had a moral core to it, covered quite a lot of areas, not all of them. But yeah, and compare and contrast to Sunak.
Yeah, and actually everybody I was watching it with was saying it's much better than Sunak, but that's such a low bar that it's sort of kind of meaningless comparison. I was expecting to have that feeling that you have when you're a Labour supporter. If you hate it, it's working. And I did have that feeling a lot of times. But I also did, feel quite kind of moved at the end.
Yeah. He looked like a prime minister, didn't
he? He really did.
Yeah.
So now we just have to figure out how to make him into our prime minister once he gets
Yeah. No, quite. Well, maybe we'll get back into that. Steve, just because this is Compass, we have to talk about kind of progressive alliances, and Zoe G's already mentioned kind of mid-beds. What do you think? While their poll lead lasts, if it stays at 20%, they're going to breeze through. But if it goes down to nearer single digits, then we know they need a 12% lead or 10% lead or something to get a majority because of the way that first past the post is skewed against them. Tactical voting, tactical campaigning, it's going to be can it be a big thing? And maybe what's going to happen in mid-bed? So got any feeling for that?
I'm not going to comment on mid-bed because I haven't been there. I've heard different views, I've heard that Labour are going to win it and the Lib Dems are already out of it, but this is merely me reporting what people have told me who are interested in it. No, at the moment, I think they are on course for an overall majority, and the reasons for that we've already explored, and in a way, I think the reasons have been reinforced by the last couple of weeks. Before we leave the speech, I want to just say one other thing, which gave me some hope that Starmer is aware of the scale of the challenge in whatever form his government takes next year, when he said, I know it's a sort of neat device, but I've been worried because they've lifted so much from the sort of Tony Blair language of 2003 to 7, that he really did think he could sort of get away with the kind of 97 thing. So I liked it when he said, the scale of the challenge we face combines all of the 1945 challenges, the 1964 challenges, and the 1997 challenges, because at least, although once you've set that challenge, you've got to come up with big ideas to address them, it kind of does put into context an urgency about thinking big next year and deciding whether he's going to turn this into a really significant turning point like 45 was.
And do you think this was what I was going to get into next. Regardless of what they say or do, big turning points come around like 45, like 79, because of a combination of forces, culture, ideas, the welfare settlement went and the Thatcherite settlement. I think this is another turning point, but it could be to something much better or something much worse. Do you agree with that?
Completely agree. I've just written a book on turning points in modern Britain, beginning with 1945, and the two elections in there are 45 and 79, and the ingredients are in place again because, as you suggest, the kind of forces that brought about change after 45 was not just the election of the Labour government, but all the things that we won't go to it now, that had happened in the 30s and even during the war. And similarly, 79, it was all kinds of ingredients that brought about that Thatcher counter-revolution to 45, arising in the 60s and 70s, which we won't go into. Now you can see it. People ache for change, and their focus groups, which they're too obsessed by in Starmer's office, must tell them the aching for big change is there as it was in 45 and 79. So what it's a combination, isn't it, Neil, of underlying forces, what Callaghan called the sea change in 79, and political will. So Thatcher had the political will to seize that moment in ways that were deeply damaging, probably in all of our views, but were transformative. Now, so what we don't know yet is whether Starmer has the political will to turn this into a really significant 45-style turning point. But the ingredients are in place for such a turning point.
Okay, so you didn't want to talk about 64 or 74 because you was nowhere near alive, Zoe G. But do you think this is a big moment in British politics?
I mean, it feels like it is, and it feels like people do want change, but I don't know if they want radical change or if they want to feel more secure, and if they want to see, yes, changes made to institutions, and they understand that, for example, the NHS, you can't just keep spending on it. You also need to think about the way it's being run, for example. And I think, one of the things that Labour are treading very carefully around is obviously taxation and public spending. And that's because they know, in part, the public have kind of bought this narrative, whether or not we buy it, that there just isn't very much money and we have to be more fiscally conservative. But I think what people really want is this sense of security. I think people don't understand why, as in they're incredulous to why living standards are, seemingly getting worse, why their wages have been stagnant, all these things that have come under a Conservative government of the last 13 years. And I think they do want to see these fundamental reforms, and I think they understand that the government just can't come in and coast and just be another sort of slightly to the left Conservative government. It has to offer something new. But I don't know if it's radical in our sort of historical understanding of what radical government looked like, if that makes sense. I think people understand that, things need to change, but change might be a slower process, a more measured process. Anoush, my colleague at the New Statesman, wrote a really good piece about actually focus groups, which Labour had been looking into, and about how the word that kept coming up was security, and not in this sort of international or kind of domestic, but in terms of their money, and in terms of their kids' schools and things like that. And I think, there's just a feeling that the Conservatives just aren't fit to deliver any of that anymore. And actually people are feeling more and more insecure.
Yeah, but Zoe Williams, if there's a fresh wave coming, the government surfed that, but the most important thing is the wave, which is technology, culture, ideas, forces. Are things now, rocking around, which is going to make this a big moment? Do you think? You're looking at me very quizzically. Well, answer the question how you want.
I'm just thinking that's a super weird question, right? Because you're coming at it from all these kind of new ideas, these, technology, culture. What are they going to deliver? That is not what anybody's thinking. Everybody's looking at this thinking, this is a nightmare. This is a hellscape. What on earth are people going to do with this? Nobody's thinking you're going to find a new kind of way with AI to fix it. They're thinking, is it fixable? And I've got 4 points. If I make them really, really fast.
Really quickly.
Okay. So first of all, I interviewed Danny Dorling the other week, and he said something interesting, which I liked, which was we're heading for something disastrous, It might be a Labour government. It probably is a Labour government. But a load of councils are going to go bust in the first year of that government.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at massive, massive catastrophe. It's unavoidable. It's like we're going to be looking at tents in Hyde Park. We're going to be looking at really serious shit.
Yeah.
And
point one.
No. That's only the first half of point.
Oh, right, okay.
And actually, whether the Labour gets in as a landslide, or whether they get in coalition, or whether they get in as a government of national unity, they're going to have to do things which would have looked hyper radical, even if Corbyn had done them. So it's actually really, really good to get this kind of quite boring, like technocratic person in charge, because then at least none of that you're a communist stuff will stick. They're going to have to do big, weird things just to keep the house in order. So that's the first point. The second...
Faster.
Okay, the second point is going to be a lot faster. You know that I feel let down by the way that Labour has gone, and the fact that it has, in my view, it thinks it's just stamping out the curse of the left in the party, but to my mind, it's stamping out the actual people who care about it in the party, and it's leaving a load of people who don't really care about it in the party, and that, to me, is really incredibly sad. But I watched that speech today, and I thought, I can stay on board for this.
So, I mean, I think there's some tensions there between the kind of ultra Blairites and what Keir Starmer said.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Yeah.
And I thought, in the end, whatever the tensions are internally, I'm prepared to line up behind enough of it that I will stay in it.
Yeah, there's another reason why you want to stay in it, but we won't talk about that
no,
just
we're not
now.
talk about that.
So I don't know how the questions are coming on, Harry, but put your questions in the thing, because it's over to you lot now to in a minute to ask your questions. But back to Steve, and the last bit from me before I pass over to Harry and the people on the call to ask their questions. So what's, I mean, Zoe W started getting us into that. You're thinking at the moment there's going to be a majority, Steve. I mean, how is that going to pan out? Are they going to be able to ride the rapids? Have they got the wherewithal to ride the rapids? What might move them along quickly and accelerate them in a good way, and what might trip them up?
No, I don't think they're anywhere near ready for what will face them on day one. I mean, there has been such a focus on how to win. How to govern is a very different, though related question, because what you say in opposition does determine what you can do to some extent in government. And you see, I disagree. I think voters do want radical change. They might not articulate it as such, but when you think, what is the phrase whirling around across the political landscape? Nothing works. Nothing bloody works. And it's linked to this thing about security. I mean, I've spoken to Neil Kinnock about this. He's over 80. He says he's never known a period where people feel more insecure about everything, whether they can get to see a doctor, whether they can get on a train, whether not just crime and all the defense, the usual security things. So I think this implies the need for big, radical change, not incrementalism like New Labour 97. Clearly, in policy terms, they're not at that point yet. There is a danger that Rachel Reeves, although I think she managed in her speech to combine this thing of reassurance and inspiration, constrains herself too much to reassure markets, Middle England, the newspapers, and so on, because I think there will be a need for significant levels of investment, reform that goes beyond the sort of Blairite view of reform. Which is, let's get the private sector kind of thing. It's much more complicated and challenging than that. And I think they can bring the voters with them. But as yet, we don't know whether that will is there and whether they just come in, be very, very cautious and say, look, we're going to need 10, 15 years for this. Because I think they will find voters aren't as patient now as they were in 1997. The mood of the electorate has changed in ways that focus groups, I think, don't pick up since the crash of 2008. Look at what's happened. They voted for Brexit. In Scotland, until recently, they voted for a party that espouses independence. The kind of Jeremy Corbyn picked up a huge vote in 2017, though, of course, they still lost. The mood is turbulent and impatient for quite big change.
You look like go on, Zoe Williams.
You go.
No, you go.
Okay,
the Zoes are fighting over which Zoe goes first. We don't care.
I've got like a million things to kind of pick up on there. It not least, when you said, of course, Corbyn didn't win in 17. Of course, he didn't win in 17, but we all feel like he did, right? We we've got to be honest with ourselves. There's a bit of us that feels like he won. And that is part of the problem certainly the problem with my analysis, that, you know, I'm sort of looking back at that time and thinking he ignited something in the country that Keir certainly hasn't ignited, and nobody's ignited in my lifetime. And I really want to see that ignited again, even though it did not deliver a Labour government, self-evidently. Secondly, I feel like, you know, we kind of slip a little bit dishonestly between kind of activists and analysts when the mood takes us. You know, we kind of, whenever anything's too difficult, what should we do? We slip into kind of analysis mode, and we're like, well, this is what I think. But actually, we sort of know what we all think, and we need to start concentrating on what we all have to do.
Like?
Well, you know, there's one thing which I was going to talk to you about anyway, but I might as well talk to you about it on air.
On live, yeah.
There's, you know, a friend was talking about, it's really, really important as soon as Labour gets in, which I think they will, to set up a kind of doomsday book, what public spending should be at this point versus what it is following austerity, so that the crises, and they will be multiple, don't land on Labour's doorstep.
Yeah.
And I was like very hesitant. Well, actually, I was saying, shouldn't we start doing that now? And he was like, no, you have to wait till they get in, because it has to be a project of popping the hood. It has to be, I looked under the bonnet and this is what I found.
Yeah. I mean, I hope they're that clever that they do that. They go, look, we've opened the books now, and it's much, much worse than we expected.
Listen,
so therefore,
Neil,
we have to change tack.
We've all hoped a lot of things about them, and they haven't always done what we want. So we have to think about how we can help.
Yeah, I agree. It's down to us too.
And we have to but we have to build kind of stakeholder stuff.
Yeah.
I can't pop the hood. I can't count 2 and 3. You know, we need to figure out who's good at doing that stuff, and we need to get them in to do it. And we need to not wait for Lotto, and we need to not wait for them in government, because they aren't actually listening to us. Yeah. So we need to figure out what we can usefully do that doesn't require their say-so.
Yeah, I agree with that. Zoe G, what do you think about what's going to happen?
So I think I totally agree with I think there's sort of two things, isn't there? So there's the actually what's waiting for them when they take government, which is a whole mess of stuff basically, and you know, probably a whole amount of spending that needs to be done that they might not be in a position because of how they've tied themselves electorally to commit to. The other is what could happen to the party. At the minute, we know the party is very disciplined. Starmer runs a very tight ship. But of course, not everybody in the party is happy. Labour is a broad church of opinion, and you know, there are the members and MPs on the left who aren't, you know, always very happy with all of the policies. I mentioned the 2-child benefit cap earlier, but there's other stuff. You know, there's PR, for example, that has obviously caused issues within the party. You know, part of it depends on how big Starmer's majority is. If he's got a really big majority, then the left of the party has slightly less power. But if he has a smaller, you know, majority, they actually wield quite a lot, and they can start making, you know, their demands. And, you know, we could see divisions within the party over that. One of the things I think is quite interesting, and Steve mentioned it earlier, is obviously Labour at the minute is courting a lot of investment, courting a lot of businesses. You know, they need to get all this money from private enterprise in order to fund some of their pledges. And then we have this big workers' rights offering. And obviously there's going to be a tension there between workers and businesses. It's kind of innate, and it's all actually about what the Labour Party is fundamentally about, is representing workers. And I think it's really interesting that when he reshuffled, he kept Angela Rayner in charge of her workers' rights brief, because she's obviously that great voice on the trade union side. But actually, in a way, it could be sticky for her, because part of the trade-off has been there's going to be this big workers' rights package, but we're not going to do wealth taxes. And, you know, that's been something that's been a bit problematic for some of the unions. That might bubble over. We might see more of that, you know, as we see the extent of issues in the public sector as we see, you know, how many doctors and nurses we need, how low their pay is.
Yeah.
You know, the unions are going to say, actually, quite frankly, you need to find the money for this. And I do think there's going to be a tension there. And I think it's going to be quite difficult. Starmer needs the unions. He's not in the position Blair was in. He does need the unions on side. So I think there is going to be a fundamental tension there. And they can all keep it together to get Labour into power.
Yeah.
Once Labour are in power, the unions can start making their demands.
Yeah, and Peter Mandelson already briefing against some of that union right stuff. Harry, over to you. Get some other people other than me into this conversation, please.
Yes. So the way that we usually do this is we bring in our members to ask their questions, but because of the way everything's set up this evening, I'm just going to read out the questions myself.
Okay.
So we're going to do 2 questions to begin with, so I'll read them both out and then I'll open up to you guys to answer. So first from Titus, we've got, how strong is Labour's commitment to democratic reform and devolving power? What are its priorities for implementation and who in the shadow cabinet is driving this? And then from Terry, was there enough in the speech to resonate with young people? That was Corbyn's strength and remains vital for Labour.
I love both those questions.
Who's it going to, Harry?
Steve first.
So, having praised Starmer's speech this week, which and I think it was a good speech, here is the problem, and it relates directly to the question. You cast all our minds back to January, the big opening gambit of the new year. Keir Starmer made a speech in which he promised this historic transfer of power. He even used the phrase from the Brexit referendum, take back control. And I remember interviewing Lisa Nandy, who had the remit at the time, she's been moved since, saying this will be an historic transfer of power. And then really the theme wasn't followed up. You know, there was this big thing and then not much more has happened since. And so it is quite hard to read how this goes because all opposition parties, including Cameron actually in the build-up to 2010, argue for devolution of power. And who amongst the electorate will be against being told they are to be greatly empowered at a local level. And then when power approaches and they get into power, you know, they say, oh God, we can't do it, you know, because we're going to keep control of every halfpenny ourselves. And I think a bit of that is happening at the moment. And so the answer is, I'm not entirely clear whether that mood in January will be applied in power, or whether, as I suspect, it will be much more centrally controlled, basically by the Treasury. I mean, Rachel Reeves will be the powerhouse of this Labour government. In terms of young people, very quickly, I mean, Zoe's right to say about the 2017 election, it generated a lot of enthusiasm amongst young people. But I think we do all know they did lose there.
No, I don't know that.
No, surely not.
I don't know that.
And therefore, to be honest, I think there is a possibility, anyway, in this hunger for change, that I dare to hope that young people will get out and vote next time. I know they very rarely do. They didn't in the referendum, and they, you know, and so on. But I think it will be 14 years of one-party rule next time. And I think there is at least a possibility that the turnout amongst younger people, even if it's just a negative thing about the Tories, might be higher.
Who to next, Harry? Who do you want?
Whichever of the Zoes wants to pick it up.
Oh, it looks like
We're
Zoe.
interchangeable Zoes now.
Yeah.
Outrageous.
Okay, I'm trying to remember the thrust of the question. So the devolution point, who's championing devolution in the cabinet, right?
Yeah, how strong is Labour's commitment to democratic reform and devolving power? What are priorities for implementation and who in the shadow cabinet's driving it?
I actually know the answer to this, but
She's cheating by looking it up on her phone.
I am looking it up, but that's because I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, kind of same. So I'm a bit jealous that Zoe W's looked it up. But so, yeah, Lisa Nandy obviously had this brief, right? And she's been moved since. There was also the Gordon Brown Commission, and it recommended a load of things to do with devolution and democratic reform, House of Lords reform as well. Haven't heard a great deal about that since. And correct me if I'm wrong, was there much about devolution in today's speech?
Well, it was briefed before the speech that there would be, but then I didn't see much content.
So that's quite interesting. I think it's a really interesting point that Steve's made about the fact that obviously we know Rachel Reeves is totally in control of the shadow treasury at the minute. In fact, you'll get all Labour shadow ministers joking around, saying, "Oh, I didn't make a unfunded spending pledge there. Don't tell Rachel," because it's a widely known fact that absolutely Rachel Reeves holds the purse. So it is interesting to see what happens with devolution, because it was a big part of their offering. Starmer, this time last year was talking all about communitarianism and reinvigorating communities and having these kind of industry hubs. And that was almost what Starmerism looked like it was going to be. But yeah, I think it's interesting we've seen less of it. And the demotion of Lisa Nandy was quite significant, I think. In terms of the voice for young people, yeah, I worry about, how when Labour shifts to the centre, it loses that enthusiasm from young people. There was talk of Labour introducing votes for 16 and 17-year-olds, which seems to have been shelved. I think that's a shame, because I think it's a really good way to get, young people feeling more politically engaged. But I think there were things in today's speech, housing, although it's not going to, necessarily excite 16-year-olds, because that's quite far off in their lives, and it's going to take years for all those houses to be built, right, and become affordable. I think, hopefully, maybe there'll be a sense of maybe the anti-Tory sentiment will get young people to the ballot boxes. I don't know. But yes, I do worry that we've lost a bit of that young person enthusiasm that Corbyn's Labour brought with it.
Okay, so the devolution agenda, I've failed to find out who I think is really, really great.
Brilliant.
I know her first name is Paula. I don't know what her surname is.
Oh, okay. Right. Well, it's close. I don't know either.
She's in the shadow cabinet. Why don't you know?
I don't know.
Is it Barker? No.
Maybe. Anyway, I was on a panel with her yesterday. I thought she was really great. She had a really good bead on what was needed. But, we've got to make a clear-eyed account of what's happened. Local authorities have lost 40% of their funding within the first year of austerity. And even the ones who lost nothing after that still couldn't cope with losing that. It's a super weird political event that we've been through, that all these going concerns lost all that money and can't do what they're supposed to do. It's massive. So I sort of think the idea that there's like a devolution person who would sort out devolution is very noughties, because now we're looking at a get things back on track person who will sort out things being screwed. And that is probably everybody in the shadow cabinet. I don't say that to cover the fact that I don't know Paula's surname, but I think it also does cover the fact that I don't know Paula's surname. The thing about young people, what really bugs me about this is that I really agreed with cancelling student fees. I really agreed with forgiving their debt. I really agreed with cancelling all fees. I really agree with it. I do not agree that it's a tax gift to rich people. I do not agree that it's an anti-progressive tax. I think it's something we could afford when we were young. I'm looking at me and Neil, obviously not Zoe. And if we could afford it when we were young, all we're really saying is, why can't we afford it?
There was less of us, though, who went. That's the point, isn't it?
Fewer, Neil. If you'd been to university...
I know. I didn't. I went to a polytechnic. That's why I don't know how to speak properly.
Look, I mean, my point is, there were fewer of us, but I want there to be more of us. I don't want there to be more of us at a price of those people having to pay for it. And if you look at the American experience, you can see where student fees land you, which is basically a system of indentured servitude. Yeah. You kind of drag people out of poverty, you give them an amazing degree, you saddle them with 250 grand's worth of debt, and they're worse off than their fucking parents, even though they're so clever. Yeah. It's so outrageous. So if the kind of headline is, I think the offer to young people would be cancel student fees, but actually, if you wanted to do an offer to young people that was free, you would have a completely different political conversation. So it wouldn't be all angled towards pensioners. It wouldn't be all angled towards the triple lock. Yeah. It would be angled towards climate change. It would be angled towards housing. It would be angled towards stuff that you need now rather than protecting stuff you already have. And you can take your pick between those two things. Either of them would be really welcome.
Okay. Oh, we've got another question, Harry.
Yeah.
Because we've got 3 people, we may only get time for one, but if you've got 2 short ones.
Yes, okay, I'll read out 2 short ones quickly. One from Rob. With no cash, governments often look to civil society, communities and the voluntary sector. Will Labour do the same, and why aren't they talking about it? And then from John, is there any likelihood of a Kinnock moment as in 1992 when Labour thought that they were home only to be denied at the last minute?
Steve, do you want to go?
Yeah, well, on 1992, there's a lot of neurosis about this, but the circumstances are really completely different. By 1992, Neil Kinnock had been leader of the opposition for 9 long, wearying years. People were fed up with it. And he knows, I've talked to him about it, and it's too long. You can't do that job for 9 years where you've got no power of implementation. So all you've got is language. And Major seemed like a fresh prime minister. He was much smarter than Sunak. He did change right away. He scrapped what was a really unpopular tax, the poll tax, and so on. None of that applies now. And so I don't think there is going to be a 92-like scenario, although you can never underestimate Labour's capacity to blow things. It tends to lose elections.
Sorry to be a dick, Steve, but why did Kinnock stay on for so long?
Because it looked as if they were going to win. And, he did the hard grind for 4 years and then lost in 1987, but there was no attempt to remove it. They were slaughtered in 1987, but everyone thought he had fought a brilliant campaign, which to some extent he did do. They were still slaughtered. And then he carried on for what was another 5 years because the election was so late, like this one's going to be. But Starmer's got one advantage from COVID in that no one saw him for about 3 years. So he's still new and fresh. Unlike Neil Kinnock, who'd been ubiquitous for 9 years. No one tried. Well, actually, towards the end with Kinnock, there was an attempt to get rid of him and put in his shadow Chancellor John Smith, but it never went anywhere. But I always think he was kind of doomed to lose because he was going to be there for so long.
And about the community stuff, anything on that? Civil society, big society?
It's a good question, actually. If you're not, once you've made the decision that you're not going to spend any, or promise to spend money, which cannot be costed to the last halfpenny, people do tend to, I'm not dismissing the question, but the politicians then do tend to waffle about community and other ways of delivering services. But I think the challenge for a Labour government will be, yes, reform and using local people in all kinds of creative ways, but they are going to have to find money. I mean, this is partly an investment issue, I'm afraid.
That
it hangs over them.
Yeah. Zoe G, any tripwires and?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that point. I think, at Labour Party conference, there were lots of charities there, and they were all, desperate to kind of get the ear of a minister, after panel discussions or whatever, they'll grab someone when they come off the stage. But what they're all asking for is more money.
Right.
And I think that's probably why it's not being spoken about, because everyone needs money. Everything needs money, everything is so... The charity sector, the third sector, are doing so much heavy lifting, things like schools, community care, everything. So, it's just more demands basically on Labour. And I think they're making the point that actually they're all really struggling as well. So it's not really a good thing for Labour to draw attention to. And it's interesting, the talk about communities, sounds great. It sounds great. Everyone looking after each other, caring the community. Let's do all that. But actually, it can't just run on goodwill. It needs funding, and I think Labour know that. So it's something they avoid. I can't remember what the other question was.
Is there any trip points between now and the election, like 92? Are they going to trip up?
I'd just go back to what I said earlier. There are a number of things that could eliminate their poll lead, some within Labour, some external, some are out of their control. But actually, I think the Rutherglen by-election last week showed that Labour are actually making quite good gains in Scotland. That could have been quite a big, big pressure point. So
mid-beds might be if they split the vote and let the Tories in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually, moments like that really matter because they can shoot confidence.
Yeah.
They can start to, wobble not only the electorate but people around Starmer.
Yeah.
So possibly, but I don't. As I said before, I don't really know much about historical British elections, so I always avoid the question.
We'll show you a film of the Sheffield Rally in 92. Zoe, any trip-up points?
I absolutely love that answer. I'm not interested in your stupid
Yeah, don't ask me that, Neil.
Don't ask me. Screw you. Look, there's a massive thing here, which is that Labour doesn't have any stands. It has fans, but not stands. It doesn't have people pumping their hearts. It doesn't have people.
Which goes back to your membership point.
It goes back to the membership point. It goes back to everything, and it really makes me sad because, a party that has really feverish support can do incredible things, and a party that has soft but wide support never does any better than the numbers, and sometimes doesn't do as well as them.
Okay.
So I kind of think they're going to get over the line, but I don't think they're going to get that kind of wow.
Yeah.
And the whole Andy Beckett thing is they'll probably get a landslide, but it will be because the Tory vote has collapsed. So the actual turnout will be quite small, but it'll be so much larger than what the Conservatives got that it will look like a landslide, but it won't be a landslide, and that will have ramifications for how they govern.
Yeah.
Right? Because they'll be pretending they've got this massive mandate, which they haven't got.
Yeah. A final question from me before we wrap up on 7. I mean, Steve, I look around the world and around Europe and try to find a social democratic party that has energy, vitality and purpose, and I can't see one. I can't, Germany, obviously not in France, Spain, they're hanging on. The Scandinavians have been lost to the right. Portugal is the only place in the world where there's a kind of outright social democratic. Is this a left-wing moment or a right-wing moment? What do you think?
What in Britain?
Well, more than Britain, I think. That's the question I'm suggesting. Is it and because these things tend to happen in kind of European or global waves, aren't they? Australia struggling. There's nowhere it's vital. Is it a left-wing moment or a right-wing moment?
Well, these things are partly subjective because you could put the case either way. For example, you could say the fact that the Social Democrats recovered in Germany to get in is a sign that there is some hope on the left, but you could argue that the rise of the AfD in Germany shows that the populist right are seizing the moment. And I think this is where political will is key. You're right, it's hard to get inspired by what's happening with the Australian Labour government, with the German Social Democrat Chancellor, and so on. But I still believe that it could be a left moment because of what we've been discussing for the last 55 minutes. The themes and the language whirling around British politics, from take back control to the left behind to people's desire for better public services, could be a left moment. But then it's over to those we elect, and that I'm still not entirely sure about. And Zoe made a good point that perhaps others need to put that kind of pressure on because it could very quickly. I mean, the Tories are going to go back to the sort of populist, well, not back, continue with the populist right in opposition. So that puts even more greater pressure for this government, if it is a government, to succeed.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the alternative is dark.
Zoe Williams is going to come in here now
Well, no,
for her final point.
Somebody was saying over lunch, obviously nobody can tell I had lunch, that, there's a very real possibility of the big five being Trump, Sunak, Le Pen, Putin, and Xi Jinping. And that is massive.
Yeah.
That is like massive dark times.
Yeah. Is that the point you want to leave us on tonight?
Well, no, I'm going to leave the other Zoe to pick us back up.
Yeah. Go on, what do you think?
Well,
left-wing moment or a right-wing
I'm not going to
moment?
add much more clarity. I've been thinking recently that maybe we are going more culturally right-wing and more economically left-wing,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
Yeah.
I like that.
But then I actually maybe believe that we always end up back in the centre. So I don't know, really. I mean, I think maybe in Britain we tend to end up back in the centre. And actually we've seen the Conservatives are imploding partly because they're going so, divided and right-wing. But globally, I think there is a push for a different economic system, a more just one. And I think actually that sometimes bears out this sort of cultural conservatism in response, because people see that there are these elites and they don't like them and they want to close their border. It sort of births this feeling of injustice, often births sort of right-wing cultures. So my answer is I don't know, because I just gave two answers. But I think, maybe I'll stick with economically left-wing and culturally right-wing.
I think that could be right. And I worry about the centre in a big change moment. And I think the right are more ready for it. That post-liberal populist, they're thinking and we're not thinking.
But that's
and I worry.
kind of what I want to leave us with, right? Is whether or not we make our doomsday book, whether or not we make our kind of narrative, we've got to be fucking ready.
Yeah.
It just feels like ever since 2007, we've sat here going,
I agree.
Oh, we're going to win from this. And we never do win.
Let's
because we're
plan.
never ready.
I think we've got a plan and work. Thanks so much, Zoe and Steve. That was fantastic. The next podcast will be at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 24th of October, when we'll be joined by Claire Schultz, who did such a great work on international development during the last Labour government, to get her take on where things are now and what we can learn from that time. So make sure you tune in. Until then, thanks again to the three of you. Thanks for everyone for being with us. Thanks for Harry. Thanks for your questions. If you're listening, you want to join live next time, but you haven't yet joined us, please join Compass. You need to join us to get a good society, and everyone needs a compass to navigate these complex times. Until then, keep hopeful, keep determined, and keep well. Good night, and thank you.
Steve.
Thank you, Steve. You can go and unpack your bag now.
Are you not in conference?
No, he was.
I've got back today.
Okay.
So he's got to go and have his tea and unpack his bag. Thank you, Steve Richards. You've been a complete star.
Great
Thank you.
night.
Bye, Steve.
Bye, Steve.
Bye.
Nice to have you. Thanks, everyone. Safe trip home, back from the living room to the kitchen.